A shadow moves where secrets hide. Can you unravel it before we do? Welcome to the Silent Clue Works. I am your host, Echo of Silence. Drop a comment and share where this mystery finds you. Your thoughts always make this adventure richer. Let's dive in. I was sitting at my desk on a Thursday morning in October, typing a report that should have been finished 2 days earlier, when the doorbell rang with a kind of insistence that suggested whoever was outside had either urgent business or poor manners. Through the office windows, the light had that thin, gray quality that makes you think about wool sweaters and the approaching winter. Nero Wolfe was in his chair behind his desk, reading a book about medieval cooking techniques with the kind of concentration most people reserve for love letters or tax forms. He had come down from the plant rooms at 11 sharp, as he did every day, and had been ignoring my existence for the better part of an hour. I looked at him. He didn't look back. The doorbell rang again, longer this time, and I saw his jaw tighten slightly. He hates interruptions during his reading time almost as much as he hates working before lunch. I pushed back from my desk and walked to the front hall, flipping the switch for the stoop light. Through the one-way glass panel, I could see a woman standing on the steps. She was in her 30s, wearing a dark blue coat and a hat that looked like it had cost more than my last pair of shoes. She carried herself with a kind of careful composure that suggested she was used to being in control but wasn't entirely sure about it today. I opened the door. She looked at me with dark eyes that seemed to be cataloging details for future reference and said, "Good morning. I'm looking for Nero Wolfe. My name is Margaret Ashford." Her voice had the kind of precision that comes from expensive schools and careful practice. I told her that Mr. Wolfe was in, but that he didn't usually see people without appointments. She said she understood, but that she had been told he might make an exception in her case. When I asked who had told her that, she hesitated for just a moment before saying, "Someone who called himself the Crimson Attendant." That got my attention. I'd never heard the name before, but something about the way she said it made me think it wasn't the kind of thing you made up on the spot. I stepped aside and let her in, taking her coat and hanging it in the hall closet. Now she walked into the office without hesitation, moving with the kind of confidence that suggested she was familiar with rooms like this one. Wolfe looked up from his book as we entered, his eyes taking in the visitor with the kind of neutral assessment he reserved for new specimens. I said, "Mr. Wolfe, this is Miss Margaret Ashford. She says someone called the Crimson Attendant told her you might see her." Wolfe closed his book carefully, marking his place with a leather bookmark, and leaned back in his chair. He studied her for a long moment before speaking. "Miss Ashford," he said, "please sit down." She took the red leather chair in front of his desk, crossing her ankles and folding her hands in her lap with practiced elegance. Wolfe asked her to explain her business. She took a small breath and began speaking in the kind of measured tone that suggested she had rehearsed this conversation. She said she was a curator at the Metropolitan Museum, specializing in historical documents and manuscripts. 3 days ago, she had received a package at her office containing a wooden box and a letter. The letter was signed by someone calling himself the Crimson Attendant, and it explained that she had been chosen to participate in what he called an intellectual challenge. The box contained a puzzle that, when solved, would reveal the location of a collection of rare culinary manuscripts worth several $100,000. The letter also mentioned that 3 other people had received similar boxes, and that the first to solve the puzzle would claim the entire collection. Wolfe asked to see the letter. She reached into her purse and pulled out a folded sheet of heavy paper which she handed across the desk. Wolfe read it carefully, his lips moving slightly as he worked through the text. When he finished, he looked at her and asked why she'd come to him instead of simply attempting to solve the puzzle herself. She said she had tried, but that the box appeared to be more than just a mechanical puzzle. There were elements that suggested it required knowledge of historical cooking techniques and rare ingredients, subjects that were outside her expertise. She'd heard that Wolfe possessed both the intellectual capacity and the specialized knowledge that might be needed. She paused, then added that she was also concerned about the competitive nature of the challenge. In the letter had been quite specific about the fact that only one person could win, and she wasn't sure what that might mean for the others. Wolfe asked to see the box. She reached into her purse again and pulled out a small wooden cube, perhaps 4 inches on each side. It was made of dark mahogany with intricate inlays of what looked like ivory stained a deep red color. She placed it on his desk, and he leaned forward to examine it without touching it. After a moment, he asked if she had attempted to open it. She said she had tried for hours, but that nothing she did seemed to have any effect. The box appeared to be seamless, with no obvious hinges or latches, but she was certain it was meant to open somehow. Wolfe picked up the box and turned it slowly in his hands, studying the red inlays with the kind of attention he usually reserved for orchids or particularly complex recipes. He set it down and looked at her. "Miss Ashford," he said, "this is not a case I would ordinarily accept. However, the puzzle interests me, and I confess to some curiosity about this crimson attendant. I will take your case on the condition that when the puzzle is solved, I may examine the manuscripts before they are returned to you." She nodded quickly, relief evident on her face. Wolfe named his fee, and she wrote out a check without hesitation. After she left, I looked at the wooden box sitting on Wolfe's desk and asked him what he thought. He picked it up again, turning it slowly in the afternoon light. "Archie," he said, "I suspect we are about to discover that some puzzles are more dangerous than others." He set the box down and reached for his book, but I noticed he didn't open it. Instead, he sat staring at the small wooden cube, and I could practically hear the gears turning in that massive brain of his. It was after lunch before Wolfe returned to the box, which is the usual pattern in our establishment. Fritz had outdone himself with a bouillabaisse that would have made a Marseille fisherman weep with joy, and Wolfe had devoted himself to it with the kind of reverence most people reserve for religious ceremonies. During the meal, the wooden cube had sat on the side table like a patient cat, waiting for attention. We have an unwritten but ironclad rule that business does not intrude on mealtimes. So the crimson attendant would have to wait until the dishes were cleared and Wolfe had acknowledged that the world existed again. Back in the office, he positioned the box in the center of his desk blotter and studied it under the lamp. The afternoon light was thin and gray, making the red inlays seem to pulse with their own inner fire. I took my notebook and waited, because experience had taught me that when Wolfe stares at an object for more than 30 seconds without speaking, something interesting is about to happen. "The craftsmanship is exceptional," he said finally, turning the box slowly in his hands. "The wood is paddock, not mahogany as I first assumed. The red inlays are pink ivory, one of the rarest woods in the world. But more significantly, Archie, as these inlays are not merely decorative." He traced one of the red patterns with his finger. "They form letters, stylized but readable if you know what to look for." I came around the desk to get a better view. What I had taken for abstract geometric designs now resolved themselves into something more deliberate. The curves and lines, when viewed from the correct angle, did indeed suggest letter forms. "Crataeus," Wolfe said, rotating the box to show me each face in sequence. "A Greek physician who served under Mithridates VI. He was renowned for his knowledge of antidotes and rare herbs, and was said to have compiled extensive culinary texts, though none survive." He set the box down carefully. "Our crimson friend is not merely a puzzle maker, he's a scholar with a taste for historical reference." The doorbell rang, sharp and insistent. Wolfe's eyes flicked to the clock on the wall. It was barely 2:30. I went to the front hall and peered through the one-way glass. A man in his 40s stood on the stoop, wearing a rumpled overcoat and clutching a briefcase as if it contained state secrets. His face had the pale, strained look of someone who had been sleeping badly. I opened the door and he pushed past me without ceremony. "Is this the home of Nero Wolfe?" he demanded. When I confirmed that it was, he said, "Thank God. I was beginning to think I had the wrong address. My name is Donald Pritchard. I'm a professor at Columbia, and I need to see Mr. Wolfe immediately about the Crimson Attendant." I led him into the office, where Wolfe was still contemplating the box. Pritchard stopped dead when he saw it, his face going even paler. "So you have one too," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. He set his briefcase on the red leather chair and opened it with shaking fingers, pulling out a wooden cube that was identical to ours, except for the color of the inlays. Where ours were red, his were pale yellow. Wolfe examined the second box with the same methodical attention he had given the first. After a moment, he looked up at Pritchard. "Professor, please explain your business here, quickly and completely." Pritchard sat down heavily, his hands trembling slightly. 3 days ago, I received this box and a letter from someone calling himself the Crimson Attendant. The letter explained that I had been chosen for an intellectual competition. The 3 others had received similar boxes, and that the first to solve the puzzle would claim a collection of rare culinary manuscripts. He paused, wiping his forehead with a handkerchief. "This morning I discovered that my office at the university had been broken into. Nothing was taken except my research notes about the box. I'm convinced that one of the other recipients is trying to eliminate the competition." Wolfe set Pritchard's box next to ours on the desk. In the lamplight I could see that the yellow inlays formed different patterns than the red ones. "What does yours spell?" I asked. Wolfe traced the yellow markings with his finger. "Apicius, a Roman epicure whose cookbook is one of the few surviving culinary texts from the ancient world." He leaned back in his chair, his eyes moving from one box to the other. 2 boxes, 2 different inscriptions, both referring to historical figures associated with cooking and food preparation. This suggests that each box contains a different piece of a larger puzzle. "Then we need all 4 boxes to solve it," Pritchard said, his voice rising with anxiety. "But if the others are willing to break into offices and steal research notes, how can we trust them to cooperate?" Wolfe's expression darkened. "Professor Pritchard, did your letter specify this address as a meeting place?" "No," Pritchard replied, looking confused. "It simply mentioned that if I needed assistance with the puzzle, I might consider consulting a private detective. Someone at the university suggested Nero Wolfe. Why do you ask?" Before Wolfe could answer, the telephone rang. I picked it up and heard Margaret Ashford's voice, tight with strain. "Mr. Goodwin, something's happened. Someone broke into the museum last night. They didn't take anything from the general collection, but they went through my office thoroughly. My desk, my files, even my personal notes about the box. I think they were looking for information about the other recipients." I told her to hold on and relayed the message to Wolfe. His face had gone completely still, which is never a good sign. When Wolfe goes motionless like that, it means he's genuinely angry. "Archie," he said quietly, "it appears that our Crimson Attendant has been more manipulative than we initially assumed. He has not merely created a competition. He has orchestrated a situation designed to generate suspicion, fear, and potentially violence among the participants." He looked at Pritchard, then at me. "Someone is using these boxes to flush out people with specific knowledge and expertise, and then systematically gathering intelligence about them. The question is why." I told Margaret I would call her back and hung up. The office felt suddenly smaller, as if the walls had moved closer together. 2 break-ins in 2 days, both targeting information about the puzzle boxes. Either we were dealing with a very determined treasure hunter, or the Crimson Attendant's game was more dangerous than it appeared. Wolfe picked up both boxes and held them side by side under the lamp. "Professor Pritchard," he said, "you will remain here until this matter is resolved. Archie, call Saul Panzer. I want surveillance on Miss Ashford, and I want to know who else has been asking questions about rare culinary manuscripts in the last week." He set the boxes down with deliberate care. Someone is playing a very sophisticated game with us, and I do not appreciate being used as an unwitting pawn. I called Saul Panzer while Wolfe questioned Pritchard about the specifics of his office break-in. Saul answered on the second ring, which is standard operating procedure for him, and I gave him the assignment in under a minute. Watch Margaret Ashford, note anyone showing unusual interest in her movements, and report back by evening. When I mentioned that we might be dealing with someone who specialized in clean break-ins, Saul grunted his understanding. He's worked enough cases with us to know that when Wolfe starts talking about psychological manipulation, the opposition usually has more brains than the average thug. Pritchard was explaining that whoever had entered his office had been remarkably professional. No forced entry, no obvious disturbance except for the missing research notes and timing that suggested knowledge of the building's security routines. The campus guard had noticed nothing during his rounds, which meant either exceptional skill or inside information about Columbia's procedures. "What exactly did your stolen notes contain?" Wolfe asked, his fingers interlaced over his middle mound. "Mostly speculation," Pritchard admitted, looking embarrassed. "I'd researched the historical Apicius, made sketches of the box from various angles, and attempted to catalogue the pattern of the yellow inlays. I also noted what appeared to be faint scoring along two edges, suggesting some kind of sliding mechanism concealed within the wood grain. Nothing conclusive, but apparently valuable enough to steal." Wolfe's eyes opened fully. "Or valuable enough to provide intelligence about your progress. This suggests our adversary is not merely seeking the manuscripts, but monitoring the competition." He picked up Pritchard's yellow box and examined the edges under his desk lamp. "These scoring marks you mentioned. Show me." Pritchard leaned forward and pointed to nearly invisible lines where the yellow inlays met the darker wood. In the lamplight, I could see what he meant. Hairline traces that might indicate hidden joints or moving parts. Wolfe turned the box slowly, studying each face with the kind of attention he usually reserved for rare orchids. The doorbell rang again. Through the one-way glass, I saw a woman in her 50s with steel-gray hair pulled back in a severe bun. She wore a practical dark suit and carried a leather briefcase with the confidence of someone accustomed to being the smartest person in most rooms. When I opened the door, she looked at me with sharp blue eyes that seemed to catalogue my height, weight, and probable IQ in about 3 seconds. "I'm Dr. Helena Voss," she said without preamble. "I'm here to see Nero Wolfe about a puzzle box. I assume from your expression that I'm not the first to arrive with this particular problem." I showed her into the office, where Wolfe's eyebrows rose slightly at the sight of a third visitor. Dr. Voss took in the scene with one comprehensive glance, noting Pritchard in the red leather chair and the 2 boxes on Wolfe's desk. Without ceremony, she opened her briefcase and produced a third wooden cube, this one with inlays of deep forest green. "Theophrastus," Wolfe said immediately, examining the green patterns. "A Greek philosopher who wrote extensively about plants and their culinary properties. You are a botanist, I presume?" Dr. Voss looked genuinely impressed despite herself. "Professor of botany at Columbia, specializing in historical food plants and medieval herb gardens. The Crimson Attendant's letter suggested I might find your services useful for solving his puzzle, though it provided no specific recommendation." She paused, her expression hardening. "This morning, my laboratory was vandalized. Someone destroyed 3 months of research on medieval spice cultivation and took my notes about the box. They were very thorough and very careful to avoid the security cameras." Wolfe's face went completely expressionless, which meant he was genuinely angry. 3 break-ins, 3 sets of stolen notes, and a pattern that was becoming impossible to ignore. Someone was systematically gathering intelligence about all the puzzle recipients, and they were doing it with professional skill. "Dr. Voss," Wolfe said carefully, "did your letter specify this address as a meeting place?" "No," she replied. "It merely suggested consulting a private detective if I needed assistance with the intellectual challenge. A colleague in the classics department recommended you when I mentioned the historical nature of the puzzle. She glanced at Pritchard. Donald here, actually. Small world in academic circles. That explained the connection. Now, but it also suggested that our crimson attendant had been very clever about not directly pointing people to our door, while ensuring they would eventually arrive here anyway. The kind of manipulation that required detailed knowledge of academic, social networks, and professional relationships. Wolfe arranged all 3 boxes in a line on his desk blotter. Red, yellow, and green inlays caught the lamplight like jewels. He studied them for a long moment, his lips moving slightly as he worked through some internal calculation. "We are missing the 4th box," he announced. "The pattern demands completion. 4 historical figures, 4 colors, 4 pieces of what is undoubtedly a larger mechanism." He looked at each of his visitors in turn. "Until we have all 4 components, we cannot determine how they function together or what they are designed to reveal." "Then we need to find the 4th recipient," Pritchard said, leaning forward anxiously, "before whoever is breaking into our offices finds them first." Dr. Voss pulled a folded sheet of paper from her briefcase. "I may have already located them," she said quietly. "This morning I made some inquiries among rare book dealers who specialize in culinary manuscripts. One name came up repeatedly: Thomas Caldwell. He's been asking questions about historical cooking texts for the past week, specifically mentioning the Mithridates collection." Wolfe took the paper and examined it. It was a business card for Caldwell Rare Books with an address in the East 60s. "Have you contacted Mr. Caldwell directly?" "I tried," Dr. Voss replied. "Look, his shop has been closed for 3 days. The neighboring businesses say he left suddenly, claiming a family emergency. But his apartment building's doorman told me someone was asking about him yesterday, a young man who seemed very nervous and kept checking his watch." The office went quiet. I could see Wolfe's mind working behind his eyes, processing the implications. If Caldwell had the 4th box and had suddenly disappeared, it suggested either that he had solved the puzzle first or that someone had eliminated him from the competition entirely. "Archie," Wolfe said finally, "you will visit Mr. Caldwell's establishment. Determine whether it is truly closed or merely appears so. If you can gain entry, look for signs of the 4th box or any correspondence from our crimson attendant." He turned to his other guests. "Dr. Voss, Professor Pritchard, you will remain here. If someone is systematically targeting the puzzle recipients, separation increases vulnerability." I reached for my hat and coat. Outside, the afternoon light was fading toward the gray dusk that makes Manhattan feel like a city made of shadows. If Thomas Caldwell had the 4th box, and if he had vanished with it, then our intellectual competition had just become something considerably more dangerous. As I headed for the door, Wolfe called after me, "Archie, be particularly observant. If Mr. Caldwell has indeed disappeared, it suggests that our crimson attendant's game has rules we have not yet discovered." The trip to Caldwell Rare Books took me through the kind of October afternoon that makes you remember why people write poetry about autumn in Manhattan. Now, the air had a sharp edge that suggested winter was already packing its bags upstate, and the light had that thin, gray quality that turns even familiar streets into something from a detective novel. The shop occupied a narrow storefront on East 63rd Street, squeezed between a watch repair place and a French bakery that was doing steady business despite the weather. The windows were dark, and a hand-lettered sign hung inside the glass door announcing closure due to family emergency. I stood across the street for a few minutes, watching the pedestrian traffic and getting a feel for the neighborhood rhythm. Nothing seemed obviously wrong, but nothing seemed obviously right either. The bakery had customers coming and going. The watch shop showed signs of life. Yes, but Caldwell's place sat dark and silent, like a missing tooth in an otherwise complete smile. I crossed the street and tried the door handle. Locked, as expected, but the lock itself was standard residential hardware, nothing that would stop a professional or even a determined amateur. Through the glass, I could see shelves lined with books, a wooden counter near the back, and what looked like a small office visible through a partially open door. A woman emerged from the bakery next door, carrying a paper bag and an umbrella. She was middle-aged, with the kind of practical demeanor that suggested she noticed things and remembered them. I introduced myself as a potential customer and asked about Mr. Caldwell's absence. 3 days now, she said, shifting her umbrella to her other hand. Left in quite a hurry, he did. He said his sister in Boston was ill, but he looked more nervous than worried, if you know what I mean. Kept glancing up and down the street like he expected someone to jump out from behind a lamp post. She paused, studying my face. You're not the first to come asking. Yesterday there was a young man, very polite but jumpy as a cat. Looked like he hadn't slept in a week. I thanked her and waited until she disappeared around the corner. Then I walked around the block to check the rear access. The alley behind the building was narrow and cluttered with trash cans and fire escapes, the kind of space that exists in Manhattan because buildings were constructed at different times and nobody bothered to fill the gaps. Caldwell's back door was metal, painted a dull gray that had begun to flake, and the lock showed faint scratches around the keyhole that suggested recent attention from someone in a hurry. I used a small tool that Wolfe disapproves of but finds occasionally useful, and the lock yielded with a soft click. The justification was simple. If Caldwell had vanished under suspicious circumstances, waiting for a search warrant might mean waiting too long. Sometimes you have to choose between proper procedure and useful results. Inside, the shop smelled of old paper, leather, and something else that took me a moment to identify. Pipe tobacco, the expensive kind that comes in tins with names like English breakfast and philosopher's mixture. But underneath that was something sharper, more metallic. The smell of fear, maybe, or just the staleness that accumulates when a place has been closed up too quickly. And the back office was small and cluttered, but not with the organized chaos of a working scholar. This looked like the aftermath of a frantic search. Drawers were pulled open, papers scattered across the floor, and a metal wastebasket overturned. On the desk blotter, amidst the scattered invoices and correspondence, was a square indentation in the dust exactly the size of the wooden cubes I'd seen on Wolfe's desk. I began searching through the papers systematically. Most of the correspondence was routine business, but underneath a stack of auction catalogues, I found a leather-bound journal filled with handwritten notes. The entries were dated, starting from 4 days ago, and they chronicled Caldwell's attempts to solve his puzzle box. His handwriting was small and precise, so with occasional sketches in the margins showing different angles of a box with blue inlays. The final entry was dated yesterday and made my pulse quicken. The pattern is clear now. The 4 boxes represent the 4 humors of ancient medicine, each associated with a specific historical figure and corresponding color. Cratius red for blood, Apicius yellow for choler, Theophrastus green for phlegm, and my own box blue for melancholy. But the mechanism requires all 4 to be present simultaneously. The collaborative nature was the key all along. Meeting arranged for tonight. I photographed the relevant pages with the small camera I keep for such occasions, then continued searching. In the main shop area, I noticed that a display case containing rare cookbooks had been unlocked, and 1 volume was missing from its stand. And a small card identified the absent item as a first edition of Hannah Glass's The Art of Cookery, made plain and easy. It seemed like an odd choice for a thief, unless they were specifically interested in practical culinary history. A sound from the front of the shop froze me in place. Footsteps, careful and deliberate, moving between the shelves. I killed my flashlight and moved to the office doorway, staying in the shadows. Through the gap, I could see a figure silhouetted against the front windows. Male, medium height, moving with the kind of confidence that suggested familiarity with the space. He went directly to the desk and began searching with practiced efficiency. When he found the empty space where I had taken the journal, he made a small sound of frustration. Then he moved to a bookshelf and ran his fingers along the spines until he found what he was looking for, pulling out a slim volume and removing something from between its pages. Even from my position, I could see it was a key. He pocketed the key and headed for the front door. I waited 30 seconds, then followed him out onto the street. He walked west at a brisk pace, leading me to a brownstone on West 68th Street with a brass plate beside the door reading the Culinary History Society. He used the key to let himself in, and after 15 minutes, I saw another figure approach. A woman carrying what looked like a wooden box wrapped in cloth. I found a payphone and called Wolfe. When I relayed what I had discovered, his silence carried the weight of genuine concern. The four humors theory explains the collaborative design, he said finally. Ancient medicine held that balance required all four elements. If Caldwell was correct, these boxes cannot be solved in isolation. He paused. Archie, there was a message on the answering service while you were out. A man named Paul LeBlanc asking urgently about rare manuscript authentication. Miss Ashford identifies him as a restoration expert who worked with Caldwell frequently. Think he knows where the fourth box is? I think, Archie, that we are about to discover whether this competition is what it appears to be or something considerably more dangerous. Return immediately. We have a meeting to attend. I made it back to the brownstone in under 20 minutes, as which required some creative interpretation of traffic laws and one particularly aggressive maneuver around a delivery truck that would have made Fritz cross himself if he had witnessed it. The office felt different when I walked in, though it took me a moment to identify why. Pritchard and Dr. Voss were still there, occupying the red leather chairs with a careful distance of people who had been forced into unwanted intimacy by circumstances. The three boxes sat on Wolfe's desk where I had left them, but something about their arrangement seemed off. Wolfe was behind his desk with a beer, which meant he had been thinking hard about something while I was gone. He looked up when I entered and made the small gesture with his hand that meant I should report immediately and completely. I gave him the full account, from the scratched lock at Caldwell's shop to the journal entry about the four humors theory, finishing with the mysterious figure entering the Culinary History Society building with a key. When I mentioned the missing Hannah Glass cookbook, Dr. Voss leaned forward with interest. That's significant, she said. Glass's work was one of the first practical cookbooks to achieve wide distribution. If someone took that specific volume, they weren't just stealing a valuable book. They were taking a reference that might contain information about historical cooking techniques. Wolfe set down his beer glass with deliberate care. The pattern becomes clearer. Our Crimson Attendant has engineered a situation where four individuals with complementary expertise are forced into collaboration while simultaneously competing. The four humors theory explains the design perfectly. Each box represents one of the classical elements of ancient medicine, requiring balance and unity to function. The doorbell rang with the kind of insistence that suggested urgency rather than politeness. Through the one-way glass, I saw a thin man in his 40s with nervous energy radiating from every line of his body. He had dark circles under his eyes and kept glancing over his shoulder as if expecting pursuit. When I opened the door, he practically fell into the hall. Paul LeBlanc, he said breathlessly. I called earlier about manuscript authentication. I need to see Nero Wolfe immediately. It's about Thomas Caldwell and the puzzle boxes. I showed him into the office, where his entrance caused visible reactions from the assembled group. Margaret Ashford had returned while I was out, and she stood up when she saw him, her face going pale. Paul, what are you doing here? I thought you were working on that colonial manuscript project in Boston. LeBlanc shook his head, pulling off his coat with shaking hands. I came back yesterday when Tom called me. He said the puzzle competition had become dangerous, that someone was watching him. He asked me to hold something for him until he could figure out what to do. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a wooden box with inlays of deep sapphire blue. He gave me this and told me not to try to solve it, just to keep it safe. But he never called back, and when I went to his shop this morning it was locked up tight." Wolfe's eyes fixed on the blue box with the intensity of a cat watching a particularly interesting bird. "Mr. LeBlanc, please sit down and explain exactly what Mr. Caldwell told you. Every detail, regardless of how trivial it may seem." LeBlanc collapsed into the remaining chair, still clutching the box. "Tom called me 3 nights ago, around midnight. He was excited at first about being chosen for an intellectual competition involving rare culinary manuscripts. But then things started getting strange. He realized someone was following him, a young man in a grey coat, always at a distance, always watching. Then his apartment was searched. Nothing taken, but his files had been gone through. That's when he gave me the box and said if anything happened, I should bring it to you." Wolfe arranged all 4 boxes in a square pattern on his desk. Red, yellow, green and blue, each catching the lamplight like jewels. "The 4 humours," he murmured. "Blood, choler, phlegm and melancholy. Cratius, Apicius, Theophrastus, and the 4th would logically be Galen, whose medical theories dominated Western thought for centuries." I had been watching the boxes while he spoke, and something bothered me about their arrangement. Then I realized what it was. "Hold it," I said. "Someone's been rearranging the furniture." I pointed to the red box. "That was facing a different direction when I left, and this rug has been moved." I gestured to the Persian carpet in front of Wolfe's desk, which was shifted slightly out of alignment. Wolfe's face went completely still, which is never a good sign. He pressed the button for Fritz, who appeared wiping his hands on a kitchen towel. "Fritz, has anyone been in this office besides the people currently present?" "No, sir. Only Miss Ashford stepped out briefly to use the telephone in the front hall." No one else entered. His brow furrowed as he noticed the displaced rug. "That was straight at lunch, sir." After Fritz left, Wolfe examined the boxes more carefully. The red one had indeed been rotated, bringing a different face forward. Under the adjusted lamp angle, faint scoring marks became visible, forming a pattern that looked like a compass rose or a child's drawing of the sun. "Our adversary has been here," Wolfe said quietly. "In my office, touching my possessions, demonstrating that even the brownstone is not beyond his reach." His voice carried the kind of controlled fury that made smart people step carefully. "This is not merely trespass. It is a message." LeBlanc was studying the rotated box with professional interest. "Tom mentioned that some faces of his box only revealed details when oriented properly under light. That symbol matches something he sketched in his notes." Wolfe picked up 2 of the boxes experimentally. There was a faint click as they came together, as if magnets inside the wood had engaged. "They are not 4 separate puzzles," he said. "They are components of a single mechanism. The scoring marks are tracks for sliding joints." Dr. Voss leaned forward. "A collaborative design requiring all 4 elements to achieve balance, just like the classical theory of the humours." "Precisely," Wolfe said. "And our Crimson Attendant has been orchestrating events to bring all 4 components together, along with the expertise necessary to operate them." He looked at each person in turn. "The question is whether he intends this assembly for intellectual satisfaction or something more sinister." The telephone rang. It was Saul Panzer, reporting from his surveillance of the Culinary History Society. "Movement inside the building," he said. "Lights on the 2nd floor, and I've seen 2 people enter in the last hour. One matches the description of the young man in the grey coat." Wolfe thanked him and hung up. "The pieces are converging," he announced. "Mr. LeBlanc, you will remain here with the others. Archie, we have an appointment to keep, but we will not go as expected guests. We will go as uninvited observers with a very specific agenda." He looked at the 4 boxes, now arranged in their proper configuration on his desk. "Someone has violated the sanctity of this house and presumed to manipulate me like a piece on a chessboard. That presumption will be corrected tonight." Wolfe did not move from his chair, which should have surprised no one who knew him. When he announced that we had an appointment to keep, the royal we was purely theoretical. His idea of keeping appointments involves sending other people to places he has no intention of visiting, then extracting every detail from them afterward with the thoroughness of a customs inspector examining suspicious luggage. By 8 o'clock that evening, I was bundled into my coat and hat, while he remained planted behind his desk like a particularly large and immovable tree. "You will rendezvous with Mr. Panzer at the Culinary History Society," he instructed, in arranging the 4 puzzle boxes in a precise square on his blotter. "Observe first, act only if circumstances demand it. I want to know who is present, what they are discussing, and most importantly, what they believe these boxes are designed to accomplish." He touched the blue box with one finger. "Take only this one. If our crimson attendant has been manipulating events to bring all 4 together, he will not expect us to arrive with incomplete materials." I slipped the blue box into my inside coat pocket, where it made a solid weight against my ribs. The evening had turned cold and damp, with a fog rolling in from the Hudson that made the streetlights look like fuzzy yellow pearls strung along invisible wire. The kind of night that makes honest citizens hurry home to their dinners and dishonest ones think about opportunities that might present themselves in the gray anonymity of reduced visibility. Saul was waiting in a parked sedan 2 blocks from the Society building, reading a newspaper with the studied casualness of a man who has been watching the same doorway for 3 hours without appearing to do so. When I slid into the passenger seat, he folded the paper and nodded toward the brownstone that housed our evening's entertainment. 3 people went in between 6 and 7, he reported quietly. Young man in a gray coat, nervous type, kept checking his watch. Woman in her 40s, professional looking, carried a briefcase like it contained state secrets. Third arrival was an older gentleman with white hair and a walking stick. Lights came on in the second-floor conference room about 20 minutes ago. I've seen shadows moving against the window shades, but no clear view of what they're doing. The building looked different at night. During the day, it had been just another converted brownstone on a respectable block. Now, with yellow light seeping through partially drawn blinds and fog swirling around the iron railings, it had acquired the watchful quality of a house keeping secrets. The kind of place where serious people gathered to discuss matters they preferred not to have overheard by casual passers-by. We approached through the rear garden, where Saul's earlier reconnaissance had identified a service entrance with locks that had seen better decades. And he produced a slim tool that looked like it had been designed by someone with strong opinions about the inadequacy of standard security measures. 2 minutes later, we were inside a narrow hallway that smelled of floor wax and old coffee, with voices drifting down from the second floor. The rear staircase was carpeted and well-maintained, allowing us to climb toward the conference room without announcing our presence to anyone who might be interested in our arrival. About 2/3 of the way up, there was a small landing with a glass panel that offered a partial view into the meeting room. I positioned myself where I could observe without being immediately visible, while Saul took up a position that allowed him to watch both the room and our escape route. Through the gap in the door, I could see 3 people arranged around a long oak table covered with papers, photographs, and what appeared to be detailed sketches. The young man in the gray coat sat with his back to me, but his posture radiated the kind of nervous energy that comes from too much coffee and not enough sleep. The professional woman occupied a chair near the window, her briefcase open beside her like a portable office. At the head of the table sat the older gentleman with white hair, and something about his bearing suggested he was accustomed to being the smartest person in most rooms. "The mechanical design is clearly collaborative," the woman was saying, tapping a pencil against a photograph of what looked like wooden box components. Each piece has incomplete tracks that only align properly when the correct faces are adjacent. Forcing the mechanism could destroy the internal cipher entirely. Cipher. That single word changed everything. These weren't just puzzle boxes designed to reveal the location of rare manuscripts. They were encoding devices designed to produce information in some protected form. which meant the stakes were considerably higher than anyone had initially suggested. The older gentleman leaned back in his chair with the satisfied expression of a professor whose students had finally grasped a particularly complex theorem. "Precisely, Miss Chen. And that brings us to the fundamental question we've been avoiding. Why would someone go to such elaborate lengths to bring together 4 individuals with such specific areas of expertise? What requires the combined knowledge of historical documents, botanical identification, ancient medical theory, and rare book authentication?" The young man shifted uncomfortably. "Caldwell thought he knew," he said quietly. "Before he disappeared, he told me the competition was a fraud, that there were no manuscripts to be won. He said someone was using us to authenticate something else entirely, something that required all 4 areas of knowledge working together." "And what did Mr. Caldwell believe that something to be?" the white-haired man asked, with the patience of someone who already knew the answer. "A recipe," the young man replied. "Not for food, but for something else. Something that had been lost for centuries because it was too dangerous to preserve in any single document. He thought the Crimson Attendant had found pieces of it scattered across different historical sources. It needed our expertise to verify its authenticity and reconstruct the complete formula." Miss Chen set down her pencil with deliberate care. "What kind of recipe requires expertise in ancient medicine, rare botanicals, historical documents, and manuscript authentication?" The white-haired gentleman smiled with the kind of satisfaction that makes smart people very nervous. "The kind that could kill without leaving a trace, my dear. The kind that Mithridates VI supposedly perfected through decades of systematic experimentation. The ultimate undetectable poison, balanced against the ultimate universal antidote." The room went completely silent. I felt the blue box in my pocket like a weight of responsibility and understood suddenly why Wolfe had insisted I bring only one component. Look, if these people were right about the Crimson Attendant's true purpose, then we were dealing with something considerably more dangerous than intellectual fraud. Saul touched my sleeve lightly and gestured toward the staircase. "Time to report back to headquarters and let Wolfe decide whether we were dealing with a treasure hunter, a would-be poisoner, or something else entirely." As we made our way back down the carpeted stairs, I could hear the conversation resuming behind us, but the words were lost in the sound of my own pulse hammering in my ears. Outside, the fog had thickened, turning the streetlights into isolated pools of yellow in a gray void. I looked back at the building where 3 people were discussing recipes for death, and realized that our intellectual competition had just become something that might require considerably more than Wolfe's legendary powers of deduction to resolve safely. The drive back to the brownstone gave me time to organize my thoughts and prepare my report. Wolfe would want every detail, every nuance of tone and expression, and then he would sit in his chair, close his eyes, and work through the implications with the methodical precision that had made him the most feared detective in New York. By the time I pulled up in front of our door, I was almost looking forward to seeing what he would make of the evening's discoveries. Almost, but not quite, because somewhere in the back of my mind, a small voice was suggesting that we might have stumbled into something that even Nero Wolfe's considerable intellect might find challenging to resolve without someone getting hurt. Wolfe had not moved from his position behind the desk, which told me either that the case had his complete attention or that he had decided to become a permanent fixture in the office furniture. Given the way his eyes opened when I walked in, I decided on the former. The 3 puzzle boxes still sat in their precise arrangement on his blotter, and our 4 guests occupied their chairs with the patient resignation of people who had discovered that leaving Nero Wolfe's presence required his explicit permission. I delivered my report standing because experience had taught me that Wolfe prefers his intelligence served neat and without interruption. When I described the conversation at the Culinary History Society, particularly the discussion about Mithridates and undetectable poisons, the reaction in the room was immediate and electric. Dr. Voss went pale, Pritchard's hands began to shake, and Margaret Ashford made a small sound that might have been a gasp or a prayer. Wolfe listened with his eyes closed, his face revealing nothing of the calculations proceeding behind it. When I finished, he remained silent for a long moment, his lips moving slightly in the way that meant he was organizing information into useful patterns. Then he opened his eyes and surveyed the assembled group with the expression of a general who had just realized the enemy's true strategy. "Mithridatism," he said quietly. "The systematic ingestion of small doses of poison to build immunity. King Mithridates VI was said to have developed a universal antidote through decades of experimentation with every known toxin of his era. Most historians dismiss his methods as legend, but fragments of his work have survived in scattered references." He leaned back in his chair, the leather creaking under his weight. "Our Crimson Attendant has not been organizing a competition for rare manuscripts. He has been assembling the expertise necessary to authenticate and reconstruct one of history's most dangerous formulas." Professor Pritchard found his voice first. "Then the manuscripts we were promised?" "A fabrication," Wolfe said curtly. "The true objective is to use your combined knowledge to verify that ancient sources, taken together, describe a formula that could theoretically produce both an undetectable poison and its corresponding antidote. You were chosen not for your ability to solve puzzles, but for your specialized knowledge in fields essential to such reconstruction." The telephone rang, sharp and insistent in the suddenly quiet office. I picked it up and heard Margaret Ashford's voice, though she was sitting 3 feet away from me. The confusion lasted only a moment before I realized I was hearing an answering service message that had been recorded earlier. "Mr. Goodwin," the recorded voice said, "this is Margaret Ashford. Someone broke into my apartment this afternoon. They left a message on my desk saying the assembly must be completed tonight, or the collaboration ends permanently. And it's signed with what looks like a crimson fingerprint." I hung up and looked at Margaret, who was staring at the phone with growing alarm. "When did you record that message?" "I didn't," she said. "I've been here all evening." Before anyone could respond, the doorbell rang. Not the usual polite chime of a visitor, but 3 sharp bursts that suggested urgency bordering on desperation. Through the one-way glass, I could see a young man in a grey coat, the same nervous figure I had observed at the society meeting. He was shifting his weight from foot to foot and checking his watch with the compulsive frequency of someone under extreme pressure. I opened the door and he pushed past me without ceremony. "Where is Nero Wolfe?" he demanded. "I need to speak with him immediately about Dr. Mallory and the boxes. He's lost his mind. So he's talking about live testing and immediate implementation. We have to stop him before—" He stopped abruptly when he saw the assembled group in the office, his face cycling through surprise, recognition, and something that might have been relief. "You're all here," he said. "Thank God. Maybe it's not too late." Wolfe studied the newcomer with the attention he usually reserved for particularly interesting specimens. "You are?" "David Chen," the young man replied. "Graduate student in pharmacological history at Columbia. Dr. Mallory has been using me to research historical poison references, but I didn't understand what he was really after until tonight." He pulled a folded paper from his coat pocket. "He gave me this list of compounds to verify. When I realized what they were, I came straight here." Wolfe examined the paper, his eyebrows rising slightly as he read. "Dr. Edwin Mallory," he said, not as a question but as a statement of confirmed suspicion. He looked at Margaret. "You know this man?" "He's chairman of the research committee at the Culinary History Society," she replied. "We've worked together on exhibition loans. He's brilliant, but he's also been under investigation for misappropriating university funds for private research projects. And he would have access to academic networks, knowledge of who possessed relevant expertise, and detailed information about your professional capabilities," Wolfe concluded. "Mr. Chen, what did Dr. Mallory tell you about his timeline for this project?" Chen swallowed hard. "He said the verification phase was complete and he was ready to move to synthesis. He's arranged for laboratory access tonight, and he expects to have a working sample by morning. He looked around the room at the 4 puzzle recipients. He said if any of you refused to cooperate, there were ways to ensure compliance. The room went very quiet. I could see Wolfe's jaw tighten, which is never a good sign for whoever has attracted his attention. When Wolfe goes still like that, it means someone has crossed a line from professional adversary to personal enemy. "Mr. Chen," Wolfe said carefully, "did Dr. Mallory specify what form this compliance might take?" "He mentioned that accidents happen in laboratories," Chen replied, "particularly to people who ask too many questions or refuse to follow directions. He said the beauty of working with historical poisons was that modern forensics wouldn't know what to look for." Wolfe reached for his beer glass. He took a long swallow and set it down with deliberate precision. "Archie," he said, "call Mr. Panzer. I want surveillance on the Culinary History Society building and any laboratory facilities Dr. Mallory might access. Also call Inspector Kramer. Tell him we may have information about a potential poisoning case, but that we need to meet here rather than at headquarters." I made the calls while Wolfe questioned Chen about Mallory's research methods and timeline. By the time I finished, it was clear that we were dealing with someone who had moved beyond intellectual curiosity into genuinely dangerous territory. Mallory had been planning this reconstruction for months, systematically identifying the expertise he needed and manipulating events to bring all the pieces together. "The question now," Wolfe said, "is whether we wait for Dr. D. Mallory to complete his synthesis or whether we encourage him to come to us." He looked at the 4 boxes on his desk, then at Chen. "Mr. Chen, you will telephone Dr. Mallory and tell him that all 4 puzzle recipients are here, along with their boxes, and that they are prepared to cooperate with his research. Tell him that Mr. Goodwin's investigation has convinced them that resistance would be futile." Chen looked doubtful. "He'll be suspicious. He knows I've been having second thoughts about the project." "Precisely," Wolfe said. "Your reluctance will make the message more credible. Tell him you've realized the scope of his vision and want to be part of something historically significant. Appeal to his vanity and his sense of intellectual superiority. Suggest that he come here to oversee the final verification personally." "And if he refuses?" "He will not refuse," Wolfe said with certainty. "A man who has spent months orchestrating this elaborate manipulation will not be able to resist the opportunity to demonstrate his control over the final act. He will come, and when he does, we will be ready for him." The next hour passed with the methodical efficiency of a military operation. Chen made the call, delivering his lines with just the right mixture of nervousness and newfound enthusiasm. Mallory, as Wolfe had predicted, agreed to come to the brownstone, though he insisted on bringing his own security arrangements. Saul reported that the society building showed signs of recent activity, with lights in the laboratory spaces and at least 2 vehicles parked in the rear alley. By 10:30, the office had been arranged with more care than some museum exhibitions. The 4 puzzle boxes sat in their precise formation, each face aligned to catch the lamplight. Chairs had been positioned so that Wolfe could observe all participants without turning his head. Even the Persian rug had been straightened, as if erasing any trace of the earlier trespass. At 5 minutes before 11, the doorbell rang with the measured confidence of someone who believed he was arriving at a performance he had written and directed. Through the one-way glass, I could see Dr. Mallory standing on the stoop, his white hair catching the street light and his walking stick held with the casual authority of a man accustomed to academic deference. When I opened the door, he smiled with the satisfaction of a chess player who believed he had just achieved checkmate. "Good evening, Mr. Goodwin," he said. "I believe Mr. Wolfe and I have some business to discuss." Behind him, barely visible in the fog, I could see at least 2 other figures waiting on the sidewalk. Whatever Dr. Mallory had planned for this evening, he had not come alone, and he had not come merely to talk. I stepped aside to let him enter, feeling the weight of the moment settle around us like the fog outside. In a few minutes, we would discover whether Nero Wolfe's legendary powers of deduction were sufficient to handle a man who had spent months planning the perfect crime, or whether our intellectual competition had just become something considerably more dangerous than anyone had anticipated. Doctor. Edwin Mallory entered the office with the measured confidence of a man who believed he held all the winning cards. He was tall and distinguished, with silver hair perfectly groomed and the kind of bearing that comes from decades of academic privilege. His walking stick was genuine ivory with a silver handle shaped like a serpent, and his eyes held the cold intelligence of someone who had convinced himself that moral constraints were merely obstacles to be circumvented by superior intellect. He surveyed the assembled group with evident satisfaction, his gaze moving from the 4 puzzle boxes on Wolfe's desk to the faces of their recipients. "How gratifying to see the team assembled," he said, his voice carrying the cultured authority of someone accustomed to lecture halls and deference. Miss Ashford, Professor Pritchard, Dr. Voss, and Mr. LeBlanc, representing our absent colleague, all present with their invaluable contributions to our project. Wolfe had not risen, which was both customary and calculated. He studied Mallory with the detached interest of a naturalist observing a particularly venomous specimen. "Dr. Mallory," he said quietly, "please sit down. We have matters to discuss that require clarity rather than theatrical posturing." Mallory took the red leather chair with practiced grace, placing his walking stick across his knees. "I trust Mr. Chen has explained the situation adequately. These individuals possess knowledge essential to verifying a historical reconstruction of immense significance. The Mithridatic formula, Mr. Wolfe. The universal antidote that has eluded scholars for 2 millennia. "You mean the systematic poison," Wolfe corrected. "So you have spent months manipulating these people, believing you could reconstruct an ancient formula for undetectable murder. The puzzle boxes were merely elaborate bait to bring together the expertise you required, while providing plausible deniability for your criminal intent." Mallory's smile tightened, but his composure remained intact. "Criminal intent is such a narrow interpretation. I prefer to think of it as recovering lost knowledge that could revolutionize pharmacology. Imagine an antidote that could neutralize any toxin, or conversely, a poison so perfectly balanced that it leaves no forensic trace." "And Mr. Caldwell," Wolfe asked, "what became of your 4th collaborator when he developed inconvenient scruples?" "Thomas proved disappointingly ethical," Mallory replied with a dismissive shrug. When he realized the project's true scope, he threatened exposure. I was forced to take preventive measures. He is currently enjoying involuntary seclusion where his conscience cannot interfere with progress." The casual admission of kidnapping sent a chill through the room. I positioned myself closer to the door, noting that Mallory's backup remained visible through the window. Wolfe, however, seemed almost relaxed, which in my experience usually meant he was about to spring something unpleasant on whoever had annoyed him. "Dr. Mallory," Wolfe said, his voice carrying genuine curiosity beneath the steel. "You are an educated man with a distinguished career. What possible justification can you offer for this elaborate criminal enterprise?" Mallory leaned forward, his eyes bright with fanatic conviction. "Justification? This formula represents knowledge lost for 2,000 years. The potential applications are extraordinary. History rewards those who refuse to flinch from necessary action, not those who allow squeamishness to prevent revolutionary discoveries." "An interesting philosophy," Wolfe observed, "though it overlooks certain practical considerations. For example, you assume these boxes will reveal what you seek when properly assembled. You also assume I will cooperate in their operation. Both assumptions are flawed." Mallory reached into his jacket and produced a small vial containing clear liquid. "Mr. Wolfe, I've prepared for contingencies. This derivative compound, based on preliminary research, produces extremely unpleasant symptoms that modern medicine would struggle to treat. I prefer not to demonstrate its effectiveness, but I am prepared to do so." Wolfe regarded the vial with the mild interest he might show a slightly wilted orchid. "Dr. Mallory, you have made several critical errors. The first was assuming intellectual brilliance excuses moral bankruptcy. The second was believing manipulation could substitute for genuine cooperation. But your most significant error was presuming to dictate terms within these walls." He picked up the red puzzle box and turned it slowly under the lamp. "These boxes are trapped, Dr. Mallory. The mechanism you designed includes fail-safes that destroy their contents if forced or improperly aligned. Acid vials concealed within the wood grain. You noted the scoring marks yourself in your stolen research notes." Mallory's confidence faltered visibly. "That's impossible. I designed the sequence myself." "You designed a sequence based on incomplete information," Wolfe said calmly. "The boxes require not just proper alignment, but understanding of the underlying chemical principles. Force them, and you destroy everything you have worked to achieve." The vial in Mallory's hand trembled slightly as the implications registered. "But the formula, 3 years of research." "3 years of delusion," Wolfe corrected, "built on fragments misinterpreted through the lens of modern pharmaceutical assumptions. The ancient sources describe not a universal antidote, but a dependency system. Those who received Mithridates' daily compound were not protected from poison. They were slowly addicted to the antidote itself. Withdrawal meant death." Mallory stared at him, his face draining of color. "You're lying, trying to confuse the issue." "I am stating historical fact," Wolfe replied. "Your universal antidote would create the very condition it claims to cure. A perfect tool for political control, but hardly the pharmaceutical revolution you imagined." The doorbell rang with official insistence. Through the hall I could see Inspector Kramer's familiar bulk, flanked by uniformed officers. Mallory's backup team was already being escorted away in handcuffs. "Your associates have been detained," Wolfe informed him. "Inspector Kramer has warrants for kidnapping, extortion, and conspiracy to manufacture prohibited substances. Your elaborate game has concluded, Dr. Mallory." Mallory looked from the vial in his hand to the boxes on the desk, then at Kramer entering the office. The fight went out of him like air from a punctured balloon. "This wasn't supposed to happen," he whispered. "It was supposed to be a triumph." "Knowledge without wisdom is merely data," Wolfe said as Kramer's men moved to secure the suspect. "And ambition without ethics is simply crime." After Mallory had been removed and statements taken, the office gradually emptied. Near dawn, I found myself alone with Wolfe, who sat contemplating the 4 puzzle boxes with evident distaste. "Will you solve them?" I asked. Wolfe picked up the red box and, with a precise movement, slid a hidden panel aside. Inside was not acid or cipher, but a small piece of parchment containing what appeared to be a recipe for spiced wine. "There were no traps," he said. "No dangerous formulas, no lost knowledge of undetectable poisons. Simply an elaborate fraud built on Mallory's delusions and these people's specialized expertise." He handed me the parchment. "Fritz might find this interesting. It appears to be a genuine Roman recipe for mulled wine." "So the whole thing was based on nothing?" "On fragments of fact twisted by obsession into dangerous fantasy," Wolfe replied. "The most hazardous kind of delusion." He stood and moved toward the door. "Come, Archie. Fritz has promised sweetbreads for breakfast, and I find that exposing academic fraud always gives me an appetite." I followed him out, leaving the boxes on his desk like discarded props from a play that had run too long. Outside, the fog was lifting, and the first grey light of dawn was touching the windows of the brownstone. Another case closed, another criminal caught, and another reminder that in Nero Wolfe's world, the greatest mysteries often have the simplest solutions, hidden beneath layers of human vanity and self-deception. The office felt different in the grey light of early morning, as if the events of the night had left invisible residue on the furniture and walls. Wolfe sat behind his desk with the 4 puzzle boxes arranged before him like evidence in a trial that had already reached its verdict. The red leather chair still held the impression of our departed guests, and Inspector Kramer's cigar smoke lingered despite Fritz's efficient ventilation. I had seen this pattern before. After cases that brushed against genuine evil, Wolfe needed time to restore the equilibrium of his controlled environment. By the time Fritz announced breakfast, the sun had managed to penetrate the October clouds, casting pale rectangles of light across the Persian rug. Wolfe consumed his sweetbreads with the methodical attention he devoted to all properly prepared food, and I watched him carefully for signs that the case was actually concluded. Experience had taught me that when Wolfe announces a matter is finished, there's usually at least one loose thread waiting to unravel the neat conclusion. Inspector Kramer arrived at 9:30, looking like a man who had spent the night filling out paperwork and contemplating the various ways academic criminals could complicate his life. He settled into the red leather chair with the resigned air of someone who knew he wasn't going to like what came next, but had accepted the inevitability of hearing it. "Mallory's talking," Kramer said, pulling out one of his cigars without lighting it. Claims the whole thing was an intellectual exercise that got out of hand. His lawyers are working on reducing the charges to fraud and unlawful detention." He paused, studying Wolfe's impassive face. "We found Caldwell locked in a storage facility in Queens, dehydrated and scared, but otherwise unharmed. He confirms Mallory's threats when he tried to back out of the project." Wolfe set down his coffee cup with deliberate precision. "The district attorney will want to know about the boxes, whether they contain dangerous information or merely the products of Dr. Mallory's fevered imagination." "That's why I'm here," Kramer admitted. "What's actually in those things?" Wolfe picked up the red puzzle box and manipulated the sliding panels with practiced efficiency. The mechanism clicked softly, and revealing a small compartment lined with faded velvet. Inside was a piece of parchment covered with Latin text and what appeared to be a recipe for spiced wine. He handed it to Kramer, who examined it with the expression of a man trying to read hieroglyphics. "Historical culinary formulas," Wolfe explained. "Dr. Mallory constructed an elaborate fantasy around fragments of ancient references, convincing himself that these boxes concealed revolutionary pharmaceutical knowledge. In reality, they contain recipes for Roman digestive aids and medieval kitchen preparations." I watched as Wolfe opened each of the remaining boxes in turn. The yellow box contained dried fennel seeds, the green held a sample of wild celery, and the blue revealed another parchment fragment that, when combined with the first, described a tonic for upset stomachs. The great Mithridatic secret for which Mallory had been willing to commit kidnapping and extortion was essentially an ancient cure for indigestion. Kramer stared at the opened boxes with evident disbelief. "You're telling me this whole elaborate scheme was for old recipes?" "Dr. Mallory believed his own mythology," Wolfe replied. He had convinced himself that obscure historical references concealed secrets worth any crime. When reality failed to match his expectations, he chose to manufacture the danger he imagined rather than accept the banality of truth. After Kramer left with his evidence and his reports, the office gradually returned to its customary quiet. Our 4 clients had departed with expressions of gratitude mixed with embarrassment, and each carrying their own private version of how close they had come to being accessories in a madman's delusion. Margaret Ashford promised Wolfe first consideration for any future manuscript consultations. Professor Pritchard shook my hand like a man stepping off a sinking ship. Dr. Voss mentioned plans for a paper on the psychological misuse of historical research, carefully omitting names but not methods. Paul LeBlanc lingered longest, asking about Thomas Caldwell's recovery and expressing concern about his friend's state of mind. I assured him that between Kramer's investigation and Saul Panzer's thoroughness, Caldwell would receive all necessary support. Before leaving, LeBlanc touched the blue box still sitting on Wolfe's desk. "Tom always loved puzzles," he said quietly. "But I don't think he'd appreciate this one." When the brownstone had finally emptied of visitors and officials, I found myself alone with Wolfe in the restored sanctuary of his office. The 4 boxes sat open and harmless, their mystery dissolved into kitchen wisdom and botanical specimens. I asked the question that had been nagging at me since dawn. How did you know the boxes were safe before opening them? Wolfe's eyes opened fully, fixing me with the patient expression he reserved for obvious questions. Dr. Mallory's intellect betrayed him, Archie. A man of his vanity does not destroy his own work. He needed the validation of discovery more than he needed security. The threat of destruction was merely theatrical intimidation. He stood with the slow deliberation of a man who had been sitting too long, eyes surveying the detritus of human folly scattered across his desk. The violation of this room disturbed me more than Mallory's criminal ambitions, he said quietly. This space exists as a controlled environment where thought is possible because intrusion is minimized. To have that principle violated deliberately represents the mentality of the poisoner, making every sanctuary a potential threat. I told him Fritz had already erased all traces of the trespass, and that the rug would outlast most visitors who tried rearranging his domain. He grunted acknowledgement and moved toward the elevator. I will be in the plant rooms, he announced. If anyone calls regarding this matter, tell them the case is closed and I'm not available for further consultation. I watched him disappear into the elevator, then settled at my desk to type the final report. Outside, the October sun had burned away the morning fog, and the city was resuming its normal rhythm. Another case concluded, another criminal caught, another reminder that the most elaborate mysteries often conceal nothing more profound than human vanity and the dangerous tendency to believe what we desperately want to be true. The afternoon settled into the kind of productive quiet that follows the departure of criminals and the arrival of justice. I finished typing the report, while Wolfe remained in the plant rooms, presumably restoring his equilibrium by contemplating organisms that followed predictable patterns of growth and decay. The 4 puzzle boxes sat in their open state on his desk, their mystery reduced to kitchen wisdom and botanical specimens, and looking somehow smaller now that they had been stripped of their manufactured menace. At 3 o'clock, Thomas Caldwell arrived without calling ahead, which Fritz allowed because the man looked like he needed to sit in a safe room more than he needed to observe proper etiquette. Caldwell had been released from the hospital that morning, and while the doctors had pronounced him physically unharmed, he carried himself with the careful movements of someone who had recently discovered how quickly safety could evaporate. "Mr. Goodwin," he said, settling into the red leather chair with visible relief. "I need to understand what happened. Inspector Kramer gave me the facts, but I want to hear it from someone who was present when that madman was finally stopped." I gave him the complete account, from Margaret Ashford's first visit through Mallory's theatrical entrance and ultimate exposure. He listened with the focused attention of a man trying to make sense of a nightmare that had turned out to be based on ancient recipes for stomach ailments. When I finished, he pulled a folded paper from his jacket and handed it across the desk. "The original letter from the Crimson Attendant," he said. I should have recognized Mallory's handwriting. We'd corresponded about manuscripts for years, but the theatrical presentation distracted me from the obvious. The letter was written in elegant script on heavy parchment, signed with what appeared to be an actual fingerprint in red ink, the kind of elaborate detail that suggested months of planning and a taste for drama that bordered on obsession. "Mallory always had a flair for presentation," Caldwell continued. "Everything had to be perfect, positioned precisely, timed for maximum effect. I suppose that same compulsion drove him to create this elaborate competition instead of simply asking for our help." "Asking would have required honesty," I pointed out, "and honesty would have revealed that his grand theory was built on wishful thinking." The elevator descended with its familiar mechanical hum, and Wolfe entered carrying a small orchid bloom that had apparently displeased him. When he saw Caldwell, he nodded acknowledgement and settled into his chair with the deliberate movements of a man resuming command of his domain. "Mr. Caldwell, he said without preamble. You have recovered from your ordeal? Physically, yes. Mentally, I'm still processing the fact that I was kidnapped over recipes for Roman indigestion remedies. Wolfe picked up one of the puzzle boxes and examined it with genuine appreciation. These are remarkable pieces of craftsmanship. Where did you acquire them? An estate sale in Providence, the collection of a deceased antiquarian who specialized in wooden mechanisms. I bought all 4 together, recognizing them as a matched set, but not understanding their significance until I researched the inscriptions. And you shared this research with Dr. Mallory? I thought he might help authenticate the historical references, Caldwell admitted. Instead, he saw what he wanted to see and constructed an entire conspiracy around fragments of ancient medical theory. He looked at the opened boxes with their revealed contents. The irony is that the recipes themselves are genuinely valuable. Scholars have been trying to reconstruct Roman digestive preparations for decades. Wolfe leaned back in his chair. Dr. Mallory's fundamental error was assuming complexity where simplicity existed. The ancient physicians were not encoding secrets for future generations. They were recording practical kitchen wisdom in the language available to them. After Caldwell left with promises to provide Fritz with properly translated copies of the recipes for his collection of historical culinary documents, the office gradually returned to its customary rhythm. Margaret Ashford called to confirm that the case was closed and to ask, with careful casualness, whether any permanent stain would stick to her professional reputation. And I assured her that the official story would cast her as an innocent consultant who had the good sense to seek expert help when things became suspicious. Inspector Kramer stopped by briefly to collect the boxes as evidence and to report that Mallory was cooperating fully, apparently eager to explain his theories to anyone willing to listen. The district attorney was confident of conviction on multiple charges, though Mallory's lawyers were working to frame the whole business as an intellectual exercise that had gotten out of hand. By evening, the brownstone had purged itself of all traces of the Crimson Attendant's theatrical fraud. Fritz announced dinner with the satisfaction of a man whose domain had been restored to proper order, and we consumed his excellent veal in the dining room with the curtains drawn against the October night. The Wolfe ate with the methodical attention he devoted to all properly prepared food, and I found the familiar routine more comforting than I had expected. When we returned to the office for coffee, Wolfe settled into his chair with a sigh that seemed to release the last of his irritation at having his sanctuary violated. He poured beer from the bottle Fritz had brought and looked at me with the expression that meant conversation would be tolerated. Mallory's crime was not merely kidnapping or extortion, he said quietly. It was the corruption of intellect. To take the tools of scholarship and twist them into instruments of terror represents a betrayal of the very principles that make civilization possible. I pointed out that it was also a betrayal of common sense, since any reasonable person would have realized that ancient physicians were more likely to record practical remedies than elaborate poison formulas. Wolfe grunted agreement and reached for his book, marking the transition from detective to private citizen. The mind, he observed, is capable of constructing elaborate architectures of fear from nothing more than shadow and suggestion. Mallory built a dungeon in the air and forced 4 intelligent people to inhabit it. He opened his book with the deliberate care he brought to all his pleasures, and I knew the case of the Crimson Attendant had officially concluded. Outside, the city continued its endless cycle of ambition and folly, but inside the brownstone, order had been restored. There was logic, there was justice, and tomorrow there would be Fritz's cooking and Wolfe's orchids and whatever new mystery the doorbell might bring. It was, all things considered, a satisfactory arrangement. The rain had returned by evening, drumming against the office windows with a kind of steady persistence that made the warmth of the brownstone feel particularly precious. It was nearly midnight, and the house had settled into that profound quiet that follows the resolution of complex problems. I was at my desk, sliding the manila folder labeled Crimson Attendant into the filing cabinet with more satisfaction than usual. Most cases end with handcuffs, confessions, or bodies. This one had concluded with ancient recipes and a lesson in the dangers of academic vanity, which seemed like a considerable improvement over the alternatives. Wolfe sat behind his desk, not a book open, but unread in his lap. He was contemplating the empty space where the 4 puzzle boxes had been arranged, his eyes half closed in that meditative state that usually preceded a philosophical pronouncement. The office smelled of rain and the lingering aroma of Fritz's excellent dinner, creating an atmosphere of domestic tranquility that felt almost defiant after the day's revelations about kidnapping and extortion. The kitchen door swung open, and Fritz entered carrying a silver tray with the solemnity of a priest bearing communion wine. He placed it on Wolfe's desk with extreme care. The tray held 2 crystal glasses filled with a warm, amber liquid that steamed gently in the cool air, releasing the scent of honey, cloves, and something sharper that might have been fennel or wild celery. The preparation from the red box. Sir," Fritz announced quietly. I followed the translation exactly, though I took the liberty of straining it twice. The original text was somewhat unclear about sediment. Wolfe nodded his thanks, and Fritz retreated to his domain. I approached the desk and lifted one of the glasses, holding it to the lamplight. The liquid was deep amber with reddish highlights, almost the color of dried blood. Crimson, one might say. "So this is it," I said, inhaling the aromatic steam. "The great Mithridatic secret that Mallory was willing to commit kidnapping to obtain." "Taste it," Wolfe commanded. I took a cautious sip. The flavor was complex, beginning sweet with honey, then turning pleasantly bitter, followed by a warming sensation that spread through my chest and settled comfortably in my stomach. And it wasn't something you would order at a cocktail party, but after a heavy meal on a damp night, it was surprisingly agreeable. "Not bad," I admitted. "Tastes like mulled cider with a classical education." Wolfe took a deliberate swallow, closing his eyes to analyze the components. "It is a digestive remedy," he pronounced, setting down his glass. "Common in the 2nd century, though this particular formula uses wild celery seed, suggesting northern Italian origins. It is effective, pleasant, and entirely harmless." "And that's the punchline," I said, perching on the edge of my desk. Mallory convinced himself he was reconstructing a weapon of mass destruction when all he really had was grandmother's cure for overeating. It would be funny if we could forget about Caldwell locked in that storage facility. "It is not amusing, Archie, and it is instructive." Wolfe picked up his glass again, studying the amber liquid. Dr. Mallory succumbed to the most dangerous of intellectual traps, the assumption that antiquity is inherently more mysterious than the present. He encountered the phrase "crimson attendant" in fragmentary texts and imagined secret societies of poisoners or blood rituals. "What does it actually mean?" "A wine steward," Wolfe said with evident satisfaction. "Specifically, the servant responsible for mixing water and wine in the crater, the ceremonial bowl used at formal dinners. These bowls were typically made of red clay or burnished bronze. The crimson attendant was simply the bartender. Mallory's entire conspiracy, his grand theory of undetectable toxins, his campaign of terror, these all built on a translation error compounded by wishful thinking." The telephone rang, cutting through the quiet like an unwelcome intrusion. I answered with deliberate slowness, mostly to annoy whoever was calling at this hour. Inspector Kramer's voice crackled through the line, tired and irritated. "Goodwin. Thought Wolfe should know. Mallory's pleading insanity. Claims he was suffering from historical psychosis, whatever that means. His lawyer wants to argue the boxes were art projects." "Thanks for the update, Inspector," I replied. "Wolfe says they make excellent spice containers. You might want to check them for oregano." "Very funny. Go to hell, Goodwin." The line went dead. I hung up and turned back to Wolfe. Kramer sends his regards. Mallory is trying for the insanity defense. He is not insane, Wolfe grunted. Merely a fool with imagination, a combination that produces more chaos than clinical pathology. He finished his drink and placed the empty glass on Fritz's tray. The case is concluded satisfactorily. The criminal is incarcerated, the victims are safe, and we have been compensated adequately for our time. I finished my own glass, feeling the Roman remedy's warmth counteracting the October chill seeping through the windows. Walking to the front hall, I checked the locks with the automatic thoroughness that comes from years of dealing with people who prefer darkness to daylight. The bolt slid home with a solid, reassuring sound. When I returned to the office, Wolfe had opened his book and was reading with the focused attention that meant the case had released its hold on his mind. The office was warm, the rain was steady, and tomorrow there would be orchids and routine and whatever new mystery might present itself at our door. "Good night, sir," I said, heading for the stairs. Wolfe turned a page without looking up. "Good night, Archie. Tell Fritz that for breakfast I want the figs with cream. This Roman recipe has given me an appetite for antiquity." I climbed to my room, listening to the rain on the roof and thinking about translation errors and academic pride. It had been a strange case, full of theatrical menace that dissolved into kitchen wisdom. But as I turned out the light, I realized that was probably the best kind of case to have. The world had enough real dangers without scholars inventing new ones from ancient recipes for indigestion. Tomorrow there would be figs for breakfast and whatever came next. It was, all things considered, a perfectly satisfactory arrangement.